Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we go. It was just another ordinary day for Emily Dawson, at least, that's what everyone thought. To the outside world, she was simply a blind woman, walking down the street with her guide dog, a calm and steady golden retriever named Max. They didn't see anything unusual about the two of them. Emily had been blind for as long as she could remember. She had learned to live with it, and she'd learned how to get by, one step at a time, with Max by her side. Max was her guide, her companion, and her protector. But little did they know, Max wasn't just any dog. He wasn't even just a guide dog. Max had a history that no one could imagine, a history that would soon come into play when the wrong people picked a fight. Max wasn't the type of dog that could easily be pushed around. He had been trained for something much bigger than simply guiding Emily around town. He had been trained to serve in ways that most people could never even dream of. As Emily and Max walked down the familiar sidewalk, the busy street seemed to hum around them. Cars rushed past, people hurried by, and the noises of the city filled the air. But there was something different about this day. Emily could feel it in the air. It was like a storm was brewing, but she wasn't sure why. She could tell that something was about to happen. She had been walking this route for years, always feeling the same sense of peace as she strolled down the sidewalk with Max. He was a good dog, always alert, always calm, and always ready to protect her if needed. But today, Max seemed different. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with a quiet alertness. He was scanning the street, his ears flicking back and forth, and his nose twitching in the air. Emily didn't know what had him on edge, but she trusted him. She always trusted him. And that's when she felt it, eyes on her. A strange, uncomfortable feeling washed over her. She didn't know exactly where the eyes were coming from, but she could feel them. They were watching her, studying her. She knew they weren't looking at her out of curiosity or sympathy. No, this was something else, something colder. It was the type of stare that made her skin crawl, the type of look that made her feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong. Emily turned her head slightly, and there, across the street, she saw them. The group of bikers. They were gathered in front of a small diner, standing around their motorcycles, laughing and talking loudly. There were at least 5 of them, all wearing leather jackets and jeans, their faces covered in tattoos. They looked tough in a way that made people step out of their way, tough in a way that made people nervous. But what struck Emily the most wasn't their appearance. It was the way they were looking at her. They didn't see her as just a blind woman walking with her dog. They saw her as an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back. They saw someone they could mock, someone they could pick on, someone who wouldn't stand up for herself. And that was exactly the moment Emily knew things were going to change. Max gave a low growl beside her. It was quiet, almost like a warning, but Emily could feel the tension building in his body. She patted him gently, whispering, "It's okay, Max. We've got this." The bikers didn't stop staring at them. One of them, a tall man with a rough beard and a thick scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. He gave Emily a once-over, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. She could tell by the way he looked at her that he didn't care that she was blind. He didn't care that she had a dog with her. To him, she was just another easy target, another person to mess with. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out in a mocking tone, loud enough for the others to hear. "You lost or just out for a walk with your seeing-eye dog?" His words dripped with sarcasm. "What's he gonna do? Help you find your way home or just fetch you a soda?" The other bikers chuckled at his words, clearly entertained by his little joke. Emily felt her heart beat a little faster. She had been in situations like this before, people making fun of her, thinking she was weak, thinking she couldn't fight back. But this time felt different. She could feel the eyes of the other bikers on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She kept walking, ignoring the comments, just as she always did. She knew that if she didn't react, they would eventually get bored and move on. But Max wasn't as calm. She could feel the muscles in his body tense up. He was ready to spring into action if needed. The man continued to taunt her. "What's the matter, lady? Scared of a little fun?" He laughed again, but his laughter was short-lived as Max took a step forward, his body rigid, his eyes locked onto the man in front of them. Emily's hand tightened on Max's harness. She could feel his body coiled, ready to defend her at a moment's notice. The man noticed this, and his expression changed. He wasn't laughing anymore. He looked down at Max, sizing him up. "Oh, you think your dog's tough," he said, sneering. "You better keep him on a leash. I don't think he's got what it takes to stop me." But Max wasn't just any dog. He wasn't just a guide dog. Max had been trained for situations just like this, dangerous situations where his human needed protection. He wasn't a dog who would back down from a challenge, no matter how big the opponent was. And Emily knew this. She knew that Max was ready to protect her, no matter what. She stopped walking for a moment, standing tall with Max beside her. She didn't speak at first. She didn't have to. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers were waiting for her to react, waiting for her to show weakness. But Emily wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I think you've said enough," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "You may think you can scare me, but you're wrong. Max is not just a guide dog. He's more than that. And if you think he's just going to sit by and let you treat me like this, you've got another thing coming." For the first time, the bikers were quiet. They looked at each other, unsure of what to make of Emily's words. They had expected her to cower, to apologize, to back down. But instead, she stood her ground, her head high, her voice steady. The man with the scar on his face stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Is that so?" he said, clearly skeptical. "And just what is this dog of yours gonna do?" Emily didn't answer him right away. She didn't have to. Instead, she just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Max. And in that moment, the air seemed to shift. Max's body tensed even more, and his growl grew louder, deeper, more threatening. It wasn't a sound of fear, it was a sound of warning. The bikers took a step back, their smiles fading, replaced by uncertainty. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Max to be anything more than a regular dog. But now, they were starting to understand that this was no ordinary dog. The man with the scar frowned and stepped back, looking at the others for support. They didn't say anything. They didn't know what to do. They were all looking at Emily and Max with a new sense of respect or maybe fear. And that was when Emily knew the fight wasn't over yet, but she wasn't alone. Not with Max by her side. It started innocently enough, loud, careless laughter that echoed through the air. It wasn't anything Emily hadn't heard before. People laughing, shouting, joking around, it was part of the everyday noise in the city. She had walked down this street so many times before, and most of the time, it was just another walk. The sounds, the smells, the people, they all blurred together into a kind of peaceful rhythm that Emily had gotten used to. She knew how to move through it, how to listen carefully to the sounds around her, and how to trust Max to guide her safely. Today, though, something felt off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt it in her gut. Maybe it was the way the wind blew a little too hard or the way the air was still thicker than usual. But it was more than that. It was the way the laughter from the group of bikers across the street seemed to linger in the air, filling the space in a way that made her skin prickle. As she walked, Max's steps beside her remained steady, as they always did. His paws clicked on the pavement in rhythm with her own steps, the soft sound almost comforting in the busy city noise. But then, she heard something else. A shout directed right at her. "Hey, sweetheart, what's a blind woman doing out here, all alone?" The voice was deep, rough, and mocking. Emily froze for a second, not out of fear but because she knew the tone. It wasn't the first time someone had made fun of her. People were often rude or careless, especially when they didn't understand her or her condition. They didn't know her story or the struggles she faced every day. To them, she was just a blind woman with a dog. A simple target for teasing or jokes. She could feel the eyes of the bikers on her now, all of them looking at her, sizing her up. She didn't need to see them to know that they were enjoying the show. They were probably laughing at her, judging her for walking with a guide dog, as if that was something funny. Max's body shifted, and she felt him lean closer to her side. His usual calm and steady energy had turned to something different, something more alert. He had heard it too. He had felt the shift in the air, the way the group of bikers was making her feel uncomfortable. Max didn't need to hear the words to understand that there was something not quite right about the situation. But Emily had learned long ago to ignore the ignorance of others. She had been through it all before, people whispering behind her back, staring at her like she was different, making comments about her blindness and her reliance on Max. At first, it bothered her. But as she got older, she learned not to let it get to her. She learned to keep walking, to keep moving forward, no matter what anyone said. She wasn't about to let anyone take away her peace. So she kept walking. Her steps were calm and steady, as they always were. Max was right beside her, guiding her, helping her navigate the sidewalk, making sure she didn't trip over a crack or bump into anything. He had always been her rock, her constant companion. Emily trusted him with everything she had. But today, something was different. Emily could feel it in her bones, in the way Max was reacting to the situation. He wasn't just walking beside her now, he was tense. His muscles were tight, and his ears were flicking back and forth, scanning the surroundings. Emily knew that Max had been trained to protect her, and his instincts were kicking in. He could sense the danger that was closing in. As they walked past the group of bikers, one of them, a large man with a scruffy beard, stepped forward. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were daring her to react. He stepped right into her path, blocking her from moving forward. Emily could hear the sound of his boots hitting the ground, and she knew instantly that he was right in front of her. She stopped, her heart beating just a little faster now. She didn't know if he was trying to intimidate her or if he genuinely thought she wouldn't be able to do anything about it. But she wasn't afraid. She had dealt with people like him before. She had learned to handle situations like this. But that didn't mean the words didn't sting. "What's the dog gonna do? Lead you into the street and get you killed?" the biker asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily stood still, listening carefully. She could feel the tension in the air, like a rope stretched tight, ready to snap. The other bikers laughed, their voices loud and uncaring. The sounds of their laughter were grating, like nails on a chalkboard. Emily didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. They probably thought she couldn't fight back, that she wouldn't stand up for herself. To them, she was just a blind woman with a dog, someone easy to make fun of. But they didn't know Emily. And they definitely didn't know Max. Max's growl cut through the laughter, low and deep. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of Emily's neck stand up. Max wasn't a dog who was afraid of confrontation. He was trained to stay calm in most situations, but when he sensed that Emily was in danger, all bets were off. He was ready to protect her at any cost. His growl was a warning, and the bikers could feel it. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. The bikers leaned in closer, clearly expecting Emily to show fear, to apologize, to back down. But that's not what happened. Emily stood tall. She didn't move back or retreat. She didn't let the bikers' words shake her. She knew that Max had her back. She knew that, no matter what, she was going to be okay. Max didn't move either. He stayed by her side, his body taut with readiness. His eyes were locked on the biker in front of them, his ears flicked forward, and his mouth was open just enough to show his teeth. The biker took a step back, his eyes widening a little. He wasn't used to dogs like Max. Most people didn't know how serious it could get when Max decided to protect Emily. Emily's heart was still pounding, but she didn't let it show. She kept her voice steady when she spoke. "You think I'm weak just because I'm blind? You think you can scare me with your words?" There was a long pause. The other bikers stopped laughing, and the atmosphere changed. For the first time, they weren't looking at her like she was a target, they were looking at her like she might actually be someone they should take seriously. Emily didn't look like someone who would back down. She didn't look like someone who was scared of them. And that was something they weren't used to. The man with the scruffy beard, the one who had started all this, stood frozen for a moment. Then, he took another step back, his face darkening with frustration. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like the way Emily stood her ground, calm and steady, with Max by her side. It wasn't the reaction he had been hoping for. He gritted his teeth and glared at Emily. "Whatever," he muttered, shaking his head. "Stupid dog won't save you forever." But Emily didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to say anything more. Her eyes were steady, her heart calm. She knew Max wasn't just a dog. Max was a retired Navy SEAL K-9, trained in ways the biker could never imagine. And that was something the bikers were starting to understand. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't sure what to do. One by one, they started looking at each other, shifting uncomfortably. They weren't used to being called out like this. They weren't used to someone standing up to them, especially not someone they thought would be an easy target. Max let out another low growl, just enough to remind them that he was still there, still watching them, still ready to act if needed. The bikers, one by one, started backing off, their bravado slipping away as the reality of the situation set in. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Emily and Max to be anything more than an easy target. But now, they were beginning to realize that they had made a big mistake. And that was when Emily knew the fight wasn't over yet, but she wasn't alone. Not with Max by her side. Emily's heart beat a little faster, but her hand stayed steady on Max's harness. She could feel the tension building in the air around her, but she kept her breathing even. She was no stranger to difficult situations. She had dealt with people who underestimated her before. But this felt different. She didn't know exactly why, but she could sense that Max was on high alert, and that made her feel more aware of the change in the situation. She adjusted her sunglasses, the smooth surface of them cool against her fingertips. It was a small movement, but it gave her a moment to collect herself, to let the bikers think they still had the upper hand. The group of bikers had stopped laughing, but the silence between them felt thick. The loud, boisterous noise from just moments ago had been replaced by a kind of waiting and expectancy in the air. The bikers, now unsure of what to expect, watched her every move. They probably thought she would turn around, retreat, or even apologize for whatever they imagined she had done wrong. But that wasn't Emily. She wasn't going to retreat. Not when Max was by her side, and certainly not when she knew that something wasn't right. Max, calm and steady as ever, remained by her side. But Emily could feel him, sense the change in his stance, in the way his muscles were tensed. He wasn't just walking with her now, he was alert, his body a finely tuned machine, waiting for the right moment to act. She could feel it in the way his body shifted, even in the smallest of movements. Max had always been trained to protect, to keep her safe, and he was doing exactly that. His senses were sharper than hers, and he knew something was coming. Emily didn't need to see what was happening to know that Max was preparing himself. She could tell from the way he moved, from the stillness in the air around them. It was as if the world had paused for just a moment, holding its breath. She was used to Max sensing things she couldn't. And she had learned to trust him completely. As Emily continued walking, she felt the air around her shift. The bikers were still there, standing in front of her, but the confidence they had earlier was beginning to waver. They hadn't expected her to stay so calm, to not show fear. They hadn't expected her to be so confident. The man who had stepped forward first, the one who had made the rude comment, was now watching her more closely, his posture less certain. Emily could hear the slight shuffle of his boots as he took a small step forward, testing her. He probably thought that if he could make her react, make her show any sign of weakness, then he could control the situation. But that wasn't going to happen. Max's low growl cut through the stillness, a clear warning that he was ready to act. The sound was enough to make the biker hesitate. He had seen dogs before, but none like Max. None with the calm power that Max radiated, none with the training that made him a force to be reckoned with. Emily kept walking, her pace steady, her steps firm and sure. She didn't look at the bikers, but she could hear them moving around her, trying to figure out what she was going to do next. They didn't know her, and they didn't know Max. But Emily knew one thing for sure: she wasn't about to let them get away with this. There was something about the way the man was acting now. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. He was watching her, his eyes darting from Emily to Max and back again. Emily could tell that he wasn't sure what to make of her calm demeanor. To him, she should have been scared. She should have been afraid of the group of bikers, of their loud laughter, and their crude words. But she wasn't. And neither was Max. Max's ears perked up, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. His body was alert, tense, but not in a way that suggested he was about to attack. It was more like he was waiting for the signal, waiting for Emily to tell him what to do. But Emily wasn't giving him any direct orders; she didn't have to. Max knew her well enough to understand what was needed. And right now, he was needed as her protector. The biker in front of her took another step closer, and Emily could feel Max's body stiffen even more. Emily wasn't afraid, but she could feel the pressure building. This wasn't just a regular encounter. Something was different today. She could sense it in the way Max was reacting, in the way the bikers were starting to grow more uncertain. They hadn't expected her to stand her ground. They hadn't expected her to stay so calm. "Come on, sweetheart, don't just stand there," the man sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's the dog gonna do, huh? Lead you right into trouble." His words were meant to be mocking, but Emily didn't let them get to her. Instead, she kept walking, her steps even and sure, her focus on Max. She knew what was coming, but she didn't know exactly when it would happen. Max was waiting for the right moment. It was then that Emily heard it, the subtle shift in the air. The silence grew, the tension between the bikers thickening. Max's movements were becoming more deliberate, more calculated. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was planning. He was positioning himself, placing himself in exactly the right place to protect her. And then, Emily heard the sound of a bike revving. One of the bikers started the engine, the loud roar of the motorcycle breaking the silence. The sound was sharp, sudden, and almost deafening. The air seemed to vibrate with the noise, and for a moment, it was all Emily could hear. But through the sound, she could also feel something else: Max's alertness, his readiness. He was no longer just walking beside her. He was ready for whatever came next. The roar of the bike faded slightly as the biker revved the engine again, this time trying to get closer. Emily could hear the soft shuffle of boots, the movement of bodies shifting behind her. The bikers were testing her, seeing if they could break her resolve, if they could make her flinch. They didn't know Emily. They didn't know how long she had been through things like this, how many times she had been underestimated by people who thought they knew better. Max didn't flinch either. He was still watching, still waiting. And Emily could feel him, like a steady presence by her side. She had no doubt that Max would act if he had to. He was trained to protect her, and he wouldn't hesitate if he sensed any real danger. She could sense the growing unease in the bikers. They were beginning to realize that they weren't dealing with an easy target. Emily wasn't the scared, vulnerable woman they had assumed she was. And Max wasn't just a guide dog, he was a trained protector, a force to be reckoned with. The bikers were starting to see the cracks in their own bravado, the uncertainty creeping in as they realized they were no longer the ones in control. The biker who had stepped forward earlier, the one who had made the cruel comment, seemed to hesitate now. His face had lost some of its arrogance, and his eyes darted from Emily to Max. He seemed to be measuring the situation, trying to figure out what to do next. But the more he looked, the more he realized that he had underestimated both Emily and Max. Emily felt the shift in the air, the way the bikers were backing off ever so slightly. It wasn't a clear retreat, but there was a change in their energy. They were no longer looking at her with the same arrogance, the same mocking expressions. They were looking at her with something else: uncertainty, maybe even a little fear. And then, as quickly as it had started, the group began to break apart. One by one, the bikers started to walk away, their voices low, their movements awkward. The man who had been the most vocal was the last to leave. He shot one last, frustrated glance at Emily and Max before turning away, muttering under his breath. But Emily didn't let it bother her. She knew that this wasn't over. She knew that there would always be people like them, people who thought they could get away with mistreating others. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, and neither was Max. They had each other, and that was all they needed. As the bikers disappeared, Emily and Max continued down the street, their pace steady, their bond stronger than ever. There was a quiet strength in that moment, a feeling of victory not just over the bikers, but over every moment that had tried to break her down. Today, she had stood her ground. And today, Max had stood by her side, as he always would. And Emily knew, without a doubt, that no matter what happened next, she was ready. The air around Emily and Max was thick with tension. The bikers, still unsure of what exactly was happening, were watching the two of them closely. The once loud group of men, filled with laughter and taunts, now seemed to hesitate. For the first time, the realization was sinking in: Emily was not some helpless woman, and Max was not just a guide dog. But it wasn't until that one moment, that one action, that everything changed. Without warning, one of the bikers lunged toward Emily. His hand reached out with the intention of grabbing her arm, maybe pulling her back, or just showing his dominance. He thought she was an easy target. But he was wrong. Max's eyes locked onto the biker's hand with a sharp intensity that made the air freeze. No one had expected it. Max's muscles tensed, coiling like a spring ready to explode. In one swift motion, faster than anyone could blink, Max leapt forward with the speed of a lightning strike. The biker's hand, which had been just inches from Emily's arm, froze in midair. Max's growl, deep and menacing, filled the street. It wasn't a normal growl. It was a warning, a clear, powerful signal that Max was ready to protect. Max wasn't just a dog anymore. The calm, steady creature by Emily's side had transformed into a force of nature, a protector with skills that no one could have guessed. His presence was overwhelming, and in that moment, the bikers realized they had made a grave mistake. The biker who had lunged flinched back, his hand trembling in the air as he felt the raw intensity of Max's gaze. He had thought he could intimidate a blind woman, but now he was facing something far beyond his understanding. And then, Emily spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a power that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. "Max," she said, her voice steady and calm, "it's time." Those words were more than just an instruction. They were a signal, a quiet command that only Max understood. The bikers were left stunned, unsure of what was about to happen next. It was a simple command, but it held the weight of years of training, of understanding, and of trust. At that moment, everything about the situation shifted. The bikers who had been so confident just moments before started to realize the truth. They had assumed that Emily was just a blind woman with a guide dog, someone they could push around without a second thought. But Max wasn't just any dog. He wasn't just there to help her cross the street or guide her through the world. Max had been trained for something much more intense. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a retired Navy SEAL K-9. His training had been top secret, a part of a highly specialized program that prepared him for the most dangerous and challenging situations imaginable. His skills had been honed in life and death scenarios, where every decision counted, where every move could make the difference between life and death. And now, those skills were coming to the surface, and the bikers were about to see them firsthand. As the biker in front of Emily took a step back, his smirk faded. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. The confidence he had just moments ago drained away, replaced by a mix of fear and confusion. He had thought he was in control, that he could push Emily around. But now, he was facing a trained military dog, a dog who had been through things that no one could imagine. Max stood tall, his eyes never leaving the biker. The growl he had let out wasn't just a warning, it was a statement. Max wasn't afraid, and he wasn't going to let anyone harm Emily. The biker, who had been so eager to test his power over a blind woman, now found himself looking into the eyes of a force he couldn't control. Emily stood firm beside Max, her hand still on his harness. She didn't need to say anything more. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand respect. Max was doing all the talking now. His presence alone was enough to show the bikers that they had made a grave mistake. As Max barked once, it wasn't just a simple bark. It wasn't the kind of bark you'd hear from a playful dog or one trying to get attention. This bark was sharp, commanding, and full of authority. It was the kind of bark that said, "Stay back, don't come any closer, I'm in charge here." The sound of Max's bark reverberated through the street, and the bikers froze. Their eyes widened, and their movements became hesitant. They had expected to face an easy target, but they had underestimated Emily and they had underestimated her dog. Max wasn't just there to guide Emily, he was there to protect her, and his training made him more capable than any of them could have imagined. The bikers, once full of arrogance and bravado, now found themselves retreating. Slowly at first, one step back, then another. They hadn't expected this kind of response. They hadn't expected a dog like Max. And they certainly hadn't expected Emily to remain so calm, to stand her ground as if she knew exactly what was about to happen. Max's stance didn't change. He was still watching the bikers with a calm intensity, his body perfectly still but his muscles coiled, ready to move at any moment. Emily remained calm, her hand gently resting on Max's harness. She trusted him completely. She knew that no matter what, Max would keep her safe. The biker who had lunged forward, the one who had tried to grab Emily, was now stepping back slowly. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between Max and the others. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. He hadn't expected the quiet, blind woman to be connected to something so powerful. He had thought he could intimidate her, make her feel small, but now he was the one feeling small. The group of bikers, who had once been full of mockery and ridicule, were now looking at Emily and Max with a mix of fear and disbelief. They had all been so sure of themselves. They had thought they could bully Emily, make her feel helpless. But now they were seeing the truth. Max wasn't just a dog. He wasn't a simple guide dog. He was a Navy SEAL K-9, trained to handle the toughest situations, to protect his handler with his life if necessary. And now, the bikers were learning that they had made a mistake, one that they would never forget. As they retreated, their eyes wide and their movements unsure, Emily and Max stood tall, united and unshaken. Emily didn't need to say anything. The bikers were already learning their lesson. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated Max. And that was the moment everything changed. Max's growl, his bark, and his unwavering loyalty had shown the bikers the truth. Emily was not helpless. Max was not just a dog. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. As the bikers turned and walked away, their heads down, Emily and Max continued down the street. The world felt a little quieter now, the tension finally easing. But Emily knew that this wasn't just about winning a confrontation, it was about standing up for herself, standing up for Max, and showing the world that they were stronger than anyone could ever imagine. And as they walked on, side by side, Emily couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. She had stood her ground, and Max had been there, as always, ready to protect her when it mattered most. Max stood tall beside Emily, his posture proud and firm. His hackles were slightly raised, his eyes still locked on the retreating bikers. His growl was low, but powerful, like a distant thunderstorm waiting to burst. It was a warning, a message they couldn't ignore. The bikers, still rattled by the unexpected turn of events, looked around nervously. No one moved. The tension that had once filled the air was now replaced by an uneasy silence. One by one, the bikers began to climb back onto their motorcycles, their hands shaking slightly as they gripped the handles. They exchanged quick, whispered words, but none of them dared make a move toward Emily or Max. It was as if the very air around them had shifted. They had thought they could push around a blind woman with her guide dog. They had believed that they could make a mockery of her, show their power. But now, they were facing something far greater than they could have imagined. They had underestimated Emily, and they had seriously underestimated Max. As the last of the bikers mounted his bike, he shot one last look toward Emily. His face was pale, his expression defeated. He hadn't expected to meet resistance like this. He hadn't expected the quiet, blind woman to have a protector like Max, and certainly not one with the power and skill of a retired Navy SEAL K-9. The bikers had learned their lesson the hard way. Emily stood still, her hand resting gently on Max's harness. She didn't need to say anything. Max had already done his job. He had protected her, and together, they had shown the bikers that they were not to be underestimated. Emily gave Max a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. "Get in the car," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. There was no fear in her tone, just calm authority. Max didn't need any further instructions. He had been trained for this moment. He turned on his paws and trotted beside Emily, following her lead as they made their way to the car. His movements were smooth, confident. He had done what he was trained to do, he had protected his handler. As they walked toward the car, Emily didn't look back. There was no need. She didn't need to see the bikers anymore. She knew they wouldn't try anything again. The power of Max's presence, his training, had made that clear. And the bikers knew it too. They wouldn't dare mess with a blind woman and her Navy SEAL dog again. Word spread fast in the neighborhood. It wasn't long before everyone knew what had happened. People talked, and rumors flew. They all knew that Emily and Max were not a pair to be messed with. Emily, the woman who everyone had once assumed was helpless, had stood her ground. And Max, her faithful companion, had been the one to back her up. Together, they had proven that they were stronger than anyone had thought. The street that had once felt threatening to Emily now felt different. It felt safer, quieter. People who had once looked at her with pity now saw her in a new light. They saw her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering trust in Max. The world around her hadn't changed, but she had. And Max had too. As they walked away from the scene, side by side, there was a sense of peace in the air. Emily's steps were steady and firm, her head held high. Max trotted beside her, his movements smooth and confident. There was no longer any doubt in her mind that she was safe. She didn't need to worry about the bikers, or anyone else, anymore. They had earned their respect. Not just from the bikers, but from everyone who had ever doubted them. Max's presence was enough to keep anyone at bay. His training, his loyalty, and his strength had been on full display that day, and no one would forget it. But it wasn't just his strength that had made the difference, it was the bond between Emily and Max. Their connection, built on trust and mutual respect, was what had truly made them a force to be reckoned with. As they turned the corner and walked down the quiet street, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time that day, the street felt completely safe. The chaos of the bikers, the tension, the fear, it was all behind them now. Max, her faithful companion, had been there when she needed him most. And she knew, without a doubt, that he would always be there. She didn't need to see him to know that he was by her side, his every move in tune with hers. They were a team, and together, they were unstoppable. The bikers had learned a valuable lesson that day. They had learned that appearances could be deceiving. They had thought they could take advantage of Emily, make her feel small. But they hadn't counted on Max, the Navy SEAL K-9, who had been trained to protect and defend, no matter the odds. And now, they would think twice before ever messing with anyone again, especially not a blind woman with a dog like Max. As Emily and Max reached the end of the street, Emily took a deep breath and smiled. She didn't need to look back. She had faced her fears, stood her ground, and come out stronger on the other side. And with Max by her side, she knew there was nothing she couldn't face. Together, they had won. Together, they had shown the world what true strength looked like. And together, they would continue walking forward stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the street, Emily and Max walked off into the distance, side by side, ready for whatever came next. No one could ever take away the bond they shared, and no one could ever take away the respect they had earned that day. Because sometimes, the quietest, most underestimated people are the ones who have the most power. And sometimes, the biggest surprises come from the ones who are least expected to make a stand. But Emily and Max had already proven that to everyone. And that was enough. Sometimes, people don't always see the real strength in others. It's easy to judge people by what we see on the outside. We might look at someone who is quiet, or maybe someone who is different in some way, and think they don't have much power or influence. But here's the truth, sometimes, the people who seem the quietest or the most ordinary are the ones with the most power. And sometimes, the people who face the most challenges are the ones who can show the greatest strength. Just think about Emily and Max. Emily was a blind woman, walking through the world with her guide dog, Max. At first, people didn't think much of her. After all, she was just one person, a blind woman who needed help. But what they didn't realize was that Emily wasn't weak. She had faced many difficult challenges in her life, and every day, she showed a quiet strength. She didn't yell or fight, but she kept going, no matter what. She had learned to ignore the ignorant comments and stares, and she had developed a strength that came from within. And she had Max. Max, her dog, wasn't just any guide dog. He was special. He had been trained by the Navy SEALs. That's right, Max had been trained to protect and help people in the toughest situations. Max wasn't just a dog walking beside Emily, he was her protector, her loyal friend, and together they were unstoppable. When those bikers tried to harass Emily, they had no idea who they were messing with. They saw a blind woman and thought they could push her around. But they didn't know Emily's story. They didn't know Max's story. And they definitely didn't know how strong they both were. Emily and Max didn't need to shout or fight to prove themselves. They didn't need to make a scene. They just stood strong, side by side, and the bikers quickly learned they had made a huge mistake. This is a reminder to all of us. We can't judge people by what we see on the outside. Just because someone might be quiet, or might not look like the strongest person in the room, doesn't mean they don't have power. Emily and Max showed everyone that real strength comes from within. It's not about being the loudest or the toughest. Sometimes, it's about having the quiet strength to face challenges without fear. So, the next time you see someone who seems different, or someone you don't understand, think about Emily and Max. They didn't fit the mold of what most people might expect. But they had something much more important: courage, loyalty, and an inner strength that no one could see at first. They proved that no matter who you are or what others might think, you have the power to stand up for yourself and make a difference. You might be the quiet one in the room, or the one who feels a little different from everyone else. But that doesn't mean you aren't strong. It just means you might be the one who surprises people in the end. You might be the one who makes a stand when no one expects it. You might be the one who shows that even in the toughest situations, there's power in staying calm and strong. This story is a reminder to always look beyond the surface. Don't judge people based on what they seem to be. You never know what someone is capable of, or what kind of strength they hold. Everyone has a story, and sometimes, the quietest, most underestimated people are the ones who have the most power to change the world. So, the next time you see someone who seems different, remember this story. Remember that the quiet woman with the guide dog might be far stronger than anyone can imagine. And who knows? Maybe the person you least expect will be the one who surprises you the most. Just like Emily and Max did. This is a story of strength. Not the kind that you can see with your eyes, but the kind that comes from the heart. It's a story that teaches us not to judge too quickly, not to make assumptions, and not to underestimate someone just because they don't look like what we expect. Because in the end, it's the quiet strength that makes the biggest difference.